Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Mr. Articulate. My goal is to record and post a video of roughly 5 minutes in length that I post to YouTube every night. And when I make these videos, my aim is to speak as fluently as I can and to avoid as much as possible, ideally completely, use of all filler words such as and So I have just started reading An Enquiry into Human Understanding by David Hume. If for those of you who know, it's of course one of the more famous works of philosophy ever written in the Western tradition. And I just read section 1 of book 1, and I'm just going to summarize the key things that I read here. First, Hume makes a distinction between impressions and ideas, and I believe that he groups these two things under the catch-all term perceptions. So what we are really is perceiving organisms, and there are two types of perception that we experience: impressions and ideas. Impressions are more vivid and immediate, and under impressions he classifies sense impressions and feelings and passions. And ideas are somewhat less vivid and somewhat more abstract, and under ideas he classifies the perceptions that we experience with our thoughts. So really it's sensing and feeling versus thoughts, and he opines that there is no sort of perception that we have that does not fit cleanly into one of these two categories. He also says that for each of these categories, the impressions and the ideas, that there are simple versions and complex versions. A simple a simple impression or idea is one that you can't break into component parts. So, for example, a simple impression would be red, and then a complex impression or a complex idea is one that can be broken into multiple parts. And under this, to give another impression example, would be classified an apple. We experience an apple as an impression, but it's a complex impression because it has color and it has taste and it has feel, mouth feel in our hand, and so on. And so those are really the four categories that he draws up. And from this, he comes up with a maxim that he basically says is the thing that he will be exploring at greater length for the rest of this tome. And that maxim is that all simple ideas proceed from corresponding simple impressions. So every simple idea we have, such as the idea of red, derives from a corresponding simple impression. And so that means two things. One, every idea derives from an impression, at least with simple ones. I think with complex ones, my understanding is that is not what he's contending here. He kind of leaves complex ideas and impressions to the side. But so that's the first thing. And then the second thing that this entails is that no simple impression ever derives from a simple idea. It's always a one-way street. And the other thing in this contention of his is that when it comes to simple impressions and ideas, there is always a perfect correspondence between them, but this is not necessarily so for complex impressions and ideas. So the simple impression red and the simple idea red correspond perfectly. Likewise, the taste of an apple, for example. But then he says that a complex impression like Paris, right? So not just something really easy like an apple, but the city of Paris, his idea, when he goes, he experiences Paris through impressions. The idea that he is able to derive from the impressions of Paris will not perfectly capture everything in the impression of Paris because there's just too much complexity. And then I know he also gives an example going in the other direction for a complex idea that can't be perfectly represented in the corresponding complex impression. I'm trying to think what that would be. That I don't remember. So that's where I'm at so far. So I asked Grok before I started reading this book, and in fact, in a different context, something else I'm interested in learning about. I kind of asked for a strategy on how to read in a subject in a way where you actually retain a lot of what you read and it becomes part of the toolkit in your mind and part of the memory bank that you can draw on in the future. Because a lot of the time I read books and I definitely get a lot of good experience out of them while I read them, but I just don't retain what I read very well. And Grok suggested a few things, but the tool I'm going to use right now is that at the end of each section of the book, you make a one sentence summary of the idea or of a major idea in that section, and then you give an example, and then you try to apply it to a real world thing. So I am going to try to do that right now here on camera while still being Mr. Fluent and not using filler words. So what I will say for now is my takeaway from this section is that every simple impression and corresponding simple idea correspond perfectly with one another, and simple impressions must always simple ideas must always derive from simple impressions, never the other way around. An example of this is that the impression and the idea of red perfectly reflect one another, and they only differ in the vividness with which they are experienced, and you can derive the idea of red from the impression, but you cannot derive the impression from the idea. And if I can now apply this main idea of the section to something, an example in the real world, or to something that I already know. Here I might have to pause and think about this for a second. Right now in my head, nothing is happening. There's no activity. There's just an empty void. Yes, as I say, there's no activity. There's just a blankness in my head. With a car that's off, you put the key in the ignition to turn it on and make that engine turn over. And I don't know how to turn my mind on. What is the key that goes in the ignition? The first problem is that as I sit here in this moment, I don't have in the forefront of my head, in my working memory, the memory of what the main idea for this section is that I described. It's in there, and I could pull it back out, but it's not sitting in my working memory right now. So as I sit here, I'm waiting for it to come back into my working memory without me having to drag it out. All right, I will give an example here. It won't be a sensory one, it will be a feeling one, and I will talk about love. Love is something that I experience as an impression and that I also experience as an idea. The impression is much more vivid and the idea more dim, but the idea is an accurate representation of the impression, and the impression would be an accurate reflection of the idea. So I have the impression and the idea of love. If I had never had the feeling of love, the idea of love would have no meaning whatsoever. It would be something I could not conceive of. But having experienced love, I was then subsequently able to form an impression of it. So that's my review of the first section of the first part of Hume's book, and I will be back for subsequent sections. Possibly I'll do it for the second section and keep going each and every section. Perhaps not, I don't know. But thank you for watching to the end if you did stay this far, and I hope you have a good rest of your day or night.